Hello, my name is Sultan Al-Sharfi, and I work as a customer success manager, part of a downstream team supporting Microsoft Global strategic customers in the EMEA time zone. I'm based out of the UK, usually work with customers working on solutions utilizing Microsoft Power Platform or two or more of Microsoft clouds, mainly Azure, Dynamics, and M365. In this video, I'll try and detail one of the main steps needed to help transform your important and critical applications from using SharePoint as a data source to using Dataverse as a data source. So in a previous video, we've discussed the potential risks and the common pitfalls when using SharePoint as a data source for your important and critical applications created using Power Apps, mainly Canvas apps. And in that video, we've listed a number of go-dos to review those applications, etc. And let's say you have now done that review and you are planning now to transform some of those applications to use a more fit-for-purpose data source. And in this case, Dataverse. So transforming your application from using SharePoint as data source to Dataverse actually requires a couple of main steps. One is to migrate your data from SharePoint to Dataverse. So from SharePoint, data will, in most cases, exist in SharePoint lists, and you will need to move this data to tables within Dataverse. The second part of this process would be to reconfigure your application to use the new data source. In this specific video, we'll focus more on the first step, which is around migrating the data from SharePoint to Dataverse, and we'll be using Power Platform Dataflows to help you do that. In my opinion, it's the easiest, most straightforward way to migrate your data from SharePoint to Dataverse. Dataflows can help you achieve two things. One is to recreate or replicate the schema you have in SharePoint. So whatever lists you have in SharePoint, you can create tables in Dataverse for each of those lists, for example, as applicable in the scenario. So the data flow will look at those lists and then will create for you tables in Dataverse. But also, it will help you, the data flow will help you move the data, the actual data that is stored in those SharePoint lists to Dataverse. Of course, this can be a very straightforward scenario. If you have a simple data model, for example, the data for your app exists in one list, and probably this list is not using any of the complex data types, then it's like very quickly. You can use the data flow to very quickly replicate the list, move the data, and you'll be done and dusted very quickly. However, and that's, by the way, a very common scenario. Like I've seen many common scenarios where this is the case. However, there are other scenarios where your data model is a little bit more complex. You have multiple lists in SharePoint, part of your data model. You have relationships between those lists. You have used some complex column types, and this would involve a number of, let's say, manual steps that you have to take to complete this migration. Again, in this video, we'll also cover the most common caveats, let's say. So we'll look at a scenario that includes handling a lookup columns that has single value, which would require creating a one-to-many relationship in Dataverse, lookup columns containing multi-value, and this is one of the ways that you could fake having a many-to-many relationship in SharePoint using a multi-value lookup column. Of course, in Dataverse, many-to-many relationships are fully supported, so you can get, of course, a much better value and much better usability from many-to-many relationships in Dataverse versus in SharePoint, faking your way around it, again, by using lookup columns with multi-values or maybe creating in-between lists. So we'll be discussing all of this and, the best way to move the data. And actually, part of this video will go through some of the automations that I've created to help make the manual steps as limited as possible, which I will also share with you so you can go ahead and use it to move the data, to actually reestablish the relationships for single value lookups and the multi-value lookups. Of course, there are other things that you need to take into considerations, like other complex value types, like choice columns. So if you have configured an RBAC model in SharePoint, that would be very easy to replicate actually in Dataverse, very easy to reconfigure. Maybe you're using many flows, to break inheritance and provide list item permissions in Dataverse. This is a matter of configuration, so that's very easy to do actually. Let's set the scene now for the scenario that we have chosen to demonstrate the migration. So there is a Canvas app that employees can use to submit travel requests. So they would go to this Canvas app, whenever they have a trip and submit a travel request. This travel request gets stored in a SharePoint list, for approval, etc. What is of interest for the migration process, of course, is the schema, replicating the schema of the data model. As you can see, we have 3 lists in SharePoint. You have the travel requests list, the departments list, and the cost centers list. So those need to be recreated in Dataverse. And of course, the columns within those lists. So for most columns, it's of course a straightforward process. However, there are 2 complex type columns that will need to handle differently. So for one of which is the department column in the travel requests list, which is a single value lookup. So in Dataverse, of course, you would have to use a lookup column to reestablish this many-to-one relationship. The cost center column in the travel requests actually try and fake its way in creating many-to-many relationship, because travel requests can have many cost centers associated. A travel request can have more than one cost center associated with it, and a cost center can be associated with many travel requests. Of course, as you know, SharePoint doesn't support many-to-many relationships, and it fakes its way around it by using the multi-value lookup columns, or some people again use in-between lists. In this case, in this scenario, it's a multi-value lookup column is being used. So this, after moving the data, this would require some manual work to be done on the Dataverse side to establish a many-to-many relationship between the travel requests table and the cost centers table. And of course, as I mentioned before, we'll be using some Power Automate flows to automate this process and make it as fast and as easy as possible. So now let's take a quick look on the list that the Canvas app is currently storing the data in. So this is the SharePoint list where the data is being stored. As you can see, we have many columns. Pay close attention to, again, complex column types that will be the focus of the migration and of this demo. Mainly the department column, which is a single value lookup column, and the cost centers, which is a lookup column allowing multi-values. So if you take a quick look here, you can see that for a travel request, I can have only one department associated with it. However, I can have multiple cost centers associated with a specific travel request. So now we'll be demonstrating how to create a data flow to move the data from SharePoint to Dataverse. Mainly we'll be moving the data from a few SharePoint lists, mainly the travel requests list, but also the departments and the cost center lists. So to get to create a data flow, you just navigate to make.powerapps.com and then click on data, click on data flows, and you'll end up on this screen. So you only have to click on new data flow here. I provided a name, so let's call it SharePoint to Dataverse Demo 1, for example. Click Create. On this step, you'd have to select your data source. In our case here, it's a SharePoint online list. So I'm just going to click here. You'd need to give the website URL. So let's go ahead and grab the SharePoint site URL. So let's go back here, provide the site URL. As you can see, I have previously created a connection. If you haven't already, then this, instead of showing you a connection to reuse here, it will the page will ask you to create a connection. So click next. And it's very simple. You just need to provide, an account information in terms of a username and a password, and it should connect. Now let's pick the lists we are interested in this case, cost centers, departments, and travel requests. So those are the main lists I am interested in. So I'll click, I've had to check the checkboxes beside each. Then I'll click on transform data. So now you can see that I have 3 queries created to bring the data from each of those lists. Let's start with the simplest ones. In the case of cost centers, actually I only need a couple of columns, which is the ID and the title. So to do this, I'm going to use the choose columns option here and pick the columns I need, again, the ID and the title. There is another ID column here that you can choose, of course. It contains the same exact data. I'm not sure why do we have two of them here, but if you select both, by the way, the Dataflow will provide an error because it's Dataverse will consider this the same column name. So it would look like a duplicate column. So make sure to only choose one and choose, of course, any other columns you want. But in our case here, we're just interested in 2, ID and title. We're interested in the ID. So when we establish a relationship between travel requests and cost centers will depend on that ID value. So it's very important. I'll click OK here. And as you can see now, instead of having all the columns, we have only 2 columns. So the ID and the title of the cost center. So for departments, we can do exact same thing. Again, choose columns. And we'll go for ID and title. And as you can see now, we only we have limited, the results to only ID and title. And as you can see, whatever you select here, it does add to your Power Query statements here, so or code. Now, maybe the more complicated one to work with would be the travel requests. And in travel requests, actually, we have a few things to pay attention to here. First, let's choose some of the columns we need. So let's go ahead and choose. So again, I'll go for the ID column. I'll go for the title column. I want to go for all, the different properties of a travel request because it's I just want to show you here the concept again and how to deal with this such migration, but I'm not trying to do a like-to-like migration from the list to Dataverse. I'm going to also pick the department ID here and cost center ID, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. So those are the columns I have selected. You can see that I've got, again, ID, title, destination, travel start date, and the duration. So for each of these, you can see that it's using some automatic data type. Let's see in a travel start date, I'm not really interested in the time, so I can go ahead and transform this column and change its type to use date only. I can do the same, of course, for the end date column. For travel duration, it's actually the number of days of a trip, so I don't really need all those extra decimal points. So I can go ahead and change this to a whole number. So it's 1 day, 2 days, 7 days, etc. I don't care about the decimal values. In terms of department, I'm going to keep this as is because once data is moved, I will use a flow to establish a relationship between the travel requests table with the departments table, depending on the values in this column. However, because the cost centers column, a lookup column in SharePoint allows for multiple values, you can see that it's bringing the data over as a list instead of a just single value. So you can see here that now for the first row I have 2 values there stored, number 3 and number 1. Of course, there isn't a column type of type list in Dataverse, so I can't take this column as is. So I'm just undoing the navigation there. So I'm just going to Need to very quickly change this to this to remove this error because I just got rid of the navigation step. So we go back to where we were. So yeah, so there isn't. So if I go ahead and try and create this data flow, it will show an error to tell me, there isn't a compatible, data type in the destination for the type list. So to solve this problem, I will use, of course, the power of data query, of Power Query, sorry, to transform this column from being a list to another column that will store the same values but in a comma delimited format. So I can go ahead probably at this step here, just add my Power Query. So in this case here, as you can see, just adding a Power Query that will add a column called connection cost centers string, and will transform whatever values that is available in the cost center ID. Will transform those to a comma delimited string of values, and again store in a column called cost center string. Let's reference this correctly here. So instead of navigation, so this is navigation 1 actually. Let's do that. So now I know that I will need this new column also to be a part of my output in terms of the query. So I'm just going to pick the column name here and add it to the choose columns step here. So let's do it. Now let's look at the result. Oops, there is an error. Let's see why it's not happy. Okay, yeah, I know why it's not happy, because this step is actually referencing this step here. So there isn't a cost center string column yet. So instead of this referencing this, we'll have to have this step reference this step here. So let's do that. Hopefully now it should work. Okay, you can see that it's working, and now it has broken down this list or transformed this list into a new column and providing comma separated format, comma separated value string, and storing it in this column. Obviously, we don't need this column anymore, so I'm just going to get rid of it from the select columns step. Validate everything is working okay. So you can see everything is working okay now. I'm going to click next. And this step, the data flow will give you the option either to load data to a new table or to an existing table. So if you have the tables already created in Dataverse, you can load to existing table. But in this case, we want to load the data to a new table. Again, to show you how the data flow will replicate or will create the tables for you in Dataverse and then move the data. So I want to, of course, demonstrate that. So in terms of table name, I'll just use cost centers and then probably put some random value here. Today's date probably and time. So let's do the same here. And let's use this. In terms of primary column name, I can go with the title here. And in terms of destination, I could have converted this to integer, part of the transformation. But I don't really need to do that. But you can, of course, do that. That's fine. As part of the transformation, you can definitely do that. Departments, I can do the same here. Title, travel request. Okay, let's edit the name here for travel requests. Primary name, title. Of course, you can see like for some of the columns where we did transformation, it's already selected whole number for this one, date only for those. For the rest, it's showing as a string, as a text string, and that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and click next. And click publish. And now we are waiting. Okay. We can see now that the data flow is visible. Its current status is publishing in progress. So that's good. No errors so far. So definitely I like that. I guess we'll just wait. You can see now it's just finished publishing. Now it's doing the refresh. So basically it's executing the data flow. Of course, data flows, you can configure them to run as soon as you publish them, or you could, configure them to run on schedule to continue pulling data for you based on a specific schedule. In our case here, when you are doing a transformation, probably you want to maybe make sure you would want to use the refresh in an ad hoc process rather than a scheduled process. And once you've transformed your app, you've moved your data, you wouldn't want this workflow to run again because again you will stop using that SharePoint list. Just wait for it to finish refreshing. Okay, we can see that it finished the refresh and it was successful. You can of course look at the refresh history here in case there was errors and you want to look at it more closely. But yeah, this is great. Now let's just go to tables and search for the tables created by the data flow. You can see that it did create the tables that we requested. Let's look at the travel requests table closely here. We can see all the columns we needed had been created already. Look here, that's great. Let's click at data. And let's choose custom columns. So it only displays the columns that we're really interested in here. So basically, title, cost center string, department ID, destination ID, travel duration, start date, end date. So that's perfect. That's all the data we had in SharePoint. If we look at the other two tables here, cost centers, let's navigate direct to data. I can see all the cost centers here. Again, migrated successfully. Finally, let's look at departments. Also, can see all the departments have been migrated successfully. Again, look at custom columns here. So we can see HR is number 1, finance is 2, 3 is tech. I'm not sure what this do something is here, but yeah, again, could be a department name. That's fine. Department of people need to be doing something. Okay. So until now, we've looked at the SharePoint lists that we need to move. We've created a data flow that created for us the tables that we need with all the columns that we needed, and also moved the data from SharePoint to Dataverse. However, what had not happened yet is that we don't have the relationships between those tables created. So if you look at the department column here, it's just a text column. So it does not point or does not have a relationship with the department table. So next step now is to create a department column within the travel requests table, pointing to the departments table, and then we'll use Power Automate flows to basically look at the value stored in the department ID and updating the value in the department's lookup column based on, again, the value in the department ID column. For cost centers, it's a little bit different. We don't really need a column to be created here, actually, because again, Dataverse support many-to-many relationships. So we only need to create a relationship between the travel requests table and the cost centers table of type many-to-many, and then use the relate rows action again, using Power Automate, using the relate rows action or relate record action to create the relationship between the travel requests table and the cost centers table. This concludes the first part of this video. In the second video, you'll be able to see how I go ahead and implement the aforementioned steps.